Good morning. It was the late 1930s, setting the Soviet Union. And the setting of the situation is a relatively obscure guy giving an address to a bunch of people. And in this address, the man in charge mentions the name of Stalin, the leader in charge at that time, and the leader who is very much glorified. Immediate standing ovation for him. Of course, how could you not? The name of your great leader is said, and so you stand up and you start to applaud, and you do that for a minute, and then for another minute. And then people start to realize there's a problem. Because nobody wants to be the first to sit back down. Because they have idolized this man to such an extent that were you to sit down, you're going to face serious consequences. Ultimately, you can't keep doing that forever. There was one older gentleman, so the story goes, physically unable to keep himself standing. He was forced to sit, and the police watching took note. And the next day he was arrested and thrown in their prisons because he didn't worship their idol enough. This world has demands on the people that live in it, on us as we're here. The idea that idols might exist, that this world might want us to worship different parts of it, and it's unwilling to accept when we won't worship it to the same extent that they will. This world wants us to bow towards other things. I would direct your attention to Daniel chapter 3 this morning. It's what this story is about if you're familiar with it. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has set up a massive idol. He's proclaimed that everyone, irregardless of their religion, is to bow down and worship. And most of the world will. But God's faithful will not. And it draws a distinction between the two. And it really proves who's faithful and who isn't. Daniel chapter 3 this morning. If you were at the meetup Thursday night a couple weeks ago, I'm about to repeat a lot of what we covered there, but hopefully in the different format. Hopefully you will still get some benefits from this. Daniel chapter 3, a story that happens in the midst of Daniel. This one follows Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they confront the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. This is taking place sometime in the late 500s BC, around when Jerusalem is being destroyed by the Babylonians. If you will, we're going to start Daniel chapter 3. We're going to read the whole thing straight through. Not something that we usually do. We usually break up readings a little bit and do a few verses here and then a few verses there. I'm just going to read straight through. 30 straight verses. You're going to get the whole narrative, and then we'll come back and break it down. And if you lose your focus and your concentration while we're reading, that's okay. I'll give verse references a few times, and you can pick back up where we are and keep on going. Daniel chapter 3, let's start reading in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made a statue of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits. Its width was 6 cubits, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now Nebuchadnezzar the king also sent word to assemble the satraps and the prefects and the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the administrators of the provinces to come to the dedication of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the administrators of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before that statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, all peoples and nations and languages, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into the middle of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, as soon as the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They began to speak and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every person who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments is to fall down and worship the golden statue. But whoever does not fall down and worship should be thrown into the middle of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods, nor do they worship the golden statue which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar began speaking and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, if you're ready to fall down and worship the statue I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be thrown into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you from my hands?" Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "Nebuchadnezzar, we are not in need of an answer to give you regarding this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, we are not going to serve your gods, nor worship that golden statue that you have set up." And Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And when he ordered certain valiant warriors who were in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire, then these men were tied up in their trousers and their coats, their caps and their other clothes, and were thrown into the middle of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was so harsh, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" And they replied, "Absolutely, O king." He responded, "Look, I see 4 men, untied, walking around in the midst of the fire unharmed. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the middle of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the king's fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had even the smell of fire touched them. And Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's commands and surrendering their bodies rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should be torn limb from limb and their houses made into a rubbish heap, because there is no other God who is able to save in this way." And the king made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prosperous in the province of Babylon. Now that's a good story. I really like the first half of the book of Daniel because it's just 6 great stories, told one after the other. From a literary standpoint, that's a great story. From a structural standpoint, it's a fantastic story as it melds together. But from a practical standpoint, from a useful standpoint, is this relevant to us? It was written a couple of thousand years ago. Is it really relevant? Yes. And I'd like to talk about why. Most of the themes that you see in this chapter could be broken down into 3 simple points. 3 points that we're going to make as we go through this morning. The first point, we got to talk about pressure. The pressure that they're under. The first 15 verses covers all sorts of difficulties that these men are facing in the service of God. How do they face that pressure? How do they deal with it? What is their response to it? And ultimately, as you see in the scripture reading, those brief 3 verses in the middle, the entire chapter hinges on this point of obedience and what their obedience means even in the face of the flames. Ultimately, then, the rest of the chapter focuses on fellowship and the blessings of being obedient even in the midst of the difficulties. The point of this chapter really is an exaltation of the first commandment, that thou shalt have no other gods before me. And so I want you to think about the story of this chapter as we start to go through. Firstly, let's go ahead and talk through these 3 points. Firstly, pressure. I know that we read this story and we say, oh, they're under a lot of pressure. That must have been difficult to deal with. Yeah, I want you to understand this. I want you to think about this and to actually try and relate to it, to some of the stuff that you read. A lot of times we read this and the big words and the strange words, they're satraps. Who knows what a satrap is? What's a cubit? Like, how big is that actually? And so we have these questions. They distract us from the main point. What you have is a 60 cubit high by 6 cubit wide statue. That's 90 foot tall. 90 foot tall, 9 foot wide. A massive golden statue. 6 miles south of Babylon, Plain of Dura, most people think is 6 miles south. It's just in the wilderness somewhere. You have a massive crowd of people who are gathered to a place that is absent of anything except this massively tall statue, taller than this building, certainly. And you're told to bow down and worship that thing. That's a command from the king. And so when we start to think about pressure, question is, where are these sources of pressure? What kind of pressure are they under? Can you relate to any of this? Have you ever been pressured from authority before? You notice they have the king who's there, and the king tells them to bow down. This is the king's command. Have you ever had a boss who comes and tells you to do something that's wrong? Have you ever had a family member or a trusted source who comes and tells you to go against your conscience, to go against what you know is right or what you think is right, to contradict God and do something else? Have you ever faced any of that kind of pressure? Nebuchadnezzar is putting that on them. This isn't like a nebulous, oh, this is a big statue kind of pressure. This is a man who's in charge of you telling you what to do. You notice Nebuchadnezzar is called the king 6 times in the first 7 verses. I think there's an emphasis there. Nebuchadnezzar the king, over and over again, it hammers that point home. He has the power and the authority. Will you bow down at his command? Maybe you don't face a pressure from authority sources. Maybe you face a pressure from conformity sources. When this plane, this empty plane, has one massive statue in there, you have a massive crowd of people gathered around and everyone bows. You three who are standing are really going to make a statement, aren't you? You're really going to stick out. You can't hide anywhere. It's a massive empty plane, and you're the only people who are standing. Have you ever been in a crowd of people who are all going one way, and you, if you're going to be faithful to God, you're forced to go the other way? Call it peer pressure, usually. At work or at school when you were young. When all the people are gathered together doing one thing, and you have to stand faithfully and do something different. Can you relate to that? This is the stuff that they're facing. It's not just, oh, there's a big statue. Everyone is going against them. Can you relate to a pressure from malice? A pressure from people who are actively against you? Note in verse 8, I believe it is. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar, I think he saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing. I can't prove that. I think he saw it and passed on it and ignored it. But different people, because they're jealous. Hey, here are these Jews that you appointed over the province of Babylon. You made them, you put them in a higher up position. They didn't earn it. We, the Chaldeans, we should have gotten that by right. They're jealous. And so they come in and they accuse. Have you ever had somebody come and make an accusation about you to somebody else? And you face pressure from that because you're now fighting against someone else's accusation. I remember when I was a child, I had 4 siblings. I'm the middle one. There are a lot of accusations that get thrown around when there are 5 kids in a house. And now, and I do something, maybe it was fine, maybe it was wrong, but it slipped past mama's attention. It's totally fine. But then older brother comes along and here he says something, and now I'm in trouble. Justified as that might be, it's pressure. You understand that. We face that kind of thing when people come and point out an issue and they make a problem where there was no problem. Should relate to this. And fourthly, just the pressure from mere intimidation. I have three special words for three special men. There's a burning fiery furnace that awaits you if you do not bow. You see that warning in verse 4 or in verse 6. You see that warning again in verse 15 as Nebuchadnezzar reinforces the point. He could just say, there's a furnace waiting for you. A furnace has fire in it. A furnace is burning. You don't need to emphasize that over and over again. And yet he's pouring on the pressure. How does one escape that? Right? How does one escape from all of those things that are pushing you to go the wrong direction? I would suggest, it's very much like class this morning. I would suggest the way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego escape is they realize that there is no God behind these things. When you notice this section, when you start reading it, you read it first and it's a great story, and then you read it a second time and it's a little bit repetitive. Did you notice in verse 2, assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the administrators of the provinces? You notice in verse 3, it's those 8 groups again. I'm not going to name them all again. Did you notice how many times the list of instruments was given? Did you notice the repetition of the phrase that the king has set this statue up? Did you notice all the repetition that's going on over and over again? Nebuchadnezzar is compensating for his lack of divine backing. Over and over in this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar has set up this situation. He voices that in verse 1, in verse 15. This is the God that I have set up. More than that, you see it in verse 1, in verse 2, 2 times in verse 3, in verse 5, in verse 7, 12, 14, and 18. This is the God that Nebuchadnezzar has constructed for himself. This is not the command of the Lord. This is not divine power weighing in on earthly decisions. This is one man's want, one man's confidence that he can enforce his will on others. This is not from God. And he's trying to bring in a loud enough noise to make you forget that it's not from God. He's trying to make enough of a production that you forget that it's not from God. He's trying to make a big enough deal about it that you're convinced to follow it. But you shouldn't, because it's not from God. In Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus weighs in on situations like this, he says, you know what you should be afraid of? Be afraid of the one who can kill the body and the soul. There is a God who is behind certain things. There is a God who is exerting his pressure on the world. There is a God that you will face one day. And he will determine whether you make it to heaven or you get condemned to hell. There is a God. Follow him. A lot of earthly productions will make a lot of noise. A lot of earthly forces will try to enforce themselves as being the authority. And they'll threaten you with various punishments if you don't conform to their ideas. And they'll bring you down and they'll try to make sure that you follow them at all costs. You know what you remember? There is no God behind that. That is earthly pressure. And yes, it's real pressure. I'm not denying those things. Yes, it's real intimidation. But in the judgment day, it's not going to matter. Even when they can put you in a fiery furnace, that just sends you to heaven faster. There is no God behind these things. There's a God in heaven. And so it is from that standpoint. They know who they're afraid of. It's not Nebuchadnezzar, as blustery and as wrathful as he might be. It is the Lord. And so we will be obedient. God is against you, so we can be too. I'm going to stand on God's side, even though the physical consequences. And as they step up to make their defense, you notice that the words of the faithful are very few in this chapter. Verses 16, 17, and 18, the hinge point where things go from bad to worse or good to better, depending on your perspective. As Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego declare their faith. And their defense is pretty simple. In verse 16, it's a defense that says, hey, don't pay the musicians again because we're not going to do it no matter what. But you start to think, and again, put yourself in their situation. It's not as simple as, oh, somebody walks into a room and I say, I don't want to listen to you. I'm going to do my own thing. No, think of all the excuses that they can make. Okay, because if we were in this situation, we would start to try to make some excuses and try to justify some things. Hey, God's people need influence in the government. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are pretty high up in the government. It would be a shame if they got killed. Then God's people wouldn't have advocates up high. Maybe it's better if they just bow down for a moment. They can be forgiven later, and then we can, continue to have a good influence. No. It's an excuse that we might try and use. But God said, have no other gods before me. You don't bow down to anything else. Still wrong. Well, but the king was really gracious. He offered twice. He tried to spare us. He gave us a second opportunity. Paul said, as much as within me is, I'm supposed to be at peace with everybody. Wouldn't it be a peacemaker move to just bow down to the idol? It would make peace on earth, but it would not make peace in God's sight. If you validate the things of evil, no, sinful. Well, what if I bowed as a worker? What if I did one thing in my work life? I'm a politician by trade. What if I bow as a politician, but as an individual, I'm an upstanding person and I'm faithful to God? Isn't there a separation there? No. What excuses you from bowing to the idol? Maybe if I just do it for show, God will think that He'll know that I'm faithful in my heart and I just have to go through the motions and then I can get back to doing the right thing. No. What justifies obedience to the idol and worship the idol? Nothing justifies that. And so instead of going the human route and making the excuses that we all want to make, instead of trying to get out of the problem, instead they declare their faith. They don't take counsel. King, we're not in need of an answer. We don't need to go in a back room and huddle for 5 minutes and discuss something before we come to an answer. We know what we're doing. And so they declare their faith. You notice their faith is not just, I believe that God exists. Their faith is not, I believe that life had to come from somewhere, and so there is a God who created something. Their faith is not something trivial like that. It's not something that is light. It's not something that is not thought out. Their faith is deep. That's what inspires them to do this. Their faith knows that God has the ability to do something. O King, here's our answer. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, and He will deliver us from your hand. Okay, and God is able. I know that He can. Too many times our faith has a hang up with that. I know that God probably could, but is that true faith? Questioning whether God can? No, God can. True faith recognizes God's ability. True faith then goes the next step and recognizes that God has freedom to use that ability however He chooses. Our God, whom we serve, is able to rescue us, and He will rescue us. And if He doesn't, that's a possibility too. I'm not going to force God to listen to me. I'm not going to try and bribe God to listen to me. I'm not going to try and say, God, if you really loved me, you would help me out in this situation. That's not how it works. God has the freedom to use His ability how He sees fit. He can deliver us. He will deliver us, but He might not. But even if He does not, we know that God has expectations anyway. See, that's where truth faith differentiates itself from faith. The recognition that even if God does not step in and physically intervene in this bad situation, I still have a responsibility towards Him anyway. He promised that he would save me to heaven if I hold up my end of the bargain and I am faithful. He did not promise to pull me out of a furnace. He did not promise me a comfortable life. He did not promise me any of these physical things. He promised ultimate salvation. And so, even if he doesn't intervene in the moment like I would like him to, I know he still has expectations of me. I'm going to follow through anyway. Our God is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us, but he might not. And even if he doesn't, we will not serve your gods. We will not worship the statue, come what may. It doesn't matter. We're not going to be faithless people. That is faith. Faith is not, oh, God's probably real. Faith is this: God has made his promises, he will fulfill his promises. And I've made my promises. And now I need to fulfill my end of the bargain. He may save, he may not. Even if he doesn't, I'm still going to do the work that I know I have to do. Many people have argued that that is the miracle of Daniel 3. Not in a technical sense, not in a supernatural sense, but in a practical sense. The miracle of Daniel 3 is not that God would rescue them from the fire, although it is. The miracle is that these people were willing to stand for their faith in the midst of all their opposition, in the midst of everything that's going on in their heads and outside of them, in the midst of the king yelling at them, in the midst of the fiery furnace in the background there. The miracle is that they're able to stand for their convictions because they are grounded in the truth. And so they get to enjoy the benefits of fellowship with the God they believe. It's not done outside of the furnace. It's not that God steps in and says, Nebuchadnezzar, you should pardon them. No, God lets it get right up to the end before he steps in. He lets them get thrown into a fire. Nebuchadnezzar hears them, verse 19. His face is filled with wrath. His facial expression has changed, a very vivid picture. He just can't help himself anymore. And he snarls at them and he commands them to get thrown into this furnace. Heat it 7 times more than is normally heated. That can't really work, but he's going to try. The men, the choice men, the best men of the army who go up there, get heat stroke or something. They die from being close to the fire. But Nebuchadnezzar throws these 3 in. Throws these 3 in, and he finally sits down and is able to relax because now they're dead and now he's king and his authority has been reestablished until he looks back in the fire. There's that pastime where you sit at a campfire and you look into the flames and you see nothing, but he looks in and he sees something that he doesn't expect. And as you see the fire, we think of fire as a bad thing. We think of fire as a danger. We think of fire as harmful. May I suggest in this story, God takes what is usually harmful and uses it to bless them. See it in a variety of ways. When they go into the fire, what do they have in the fire that they don't have outside the fire? They have more support in the fire than they did outside. Didn't we throw 3 men in there? Absolutely, okay. Why do I see 4? There's more strength in there than outside. They have support in there that they didn't out here. Where are the reinforcements coming from? That's not how it's supposed to work. And yet in the fire, they are better off. I see them walking around untied. I thought I tied them in. I tied them up when I threw them in. They fell into the midst of the fire, still tied up in verse 23. And yet I see them in verse 25 untied. How are they freer in the fire than they were outside the fire? In fact, as you'll notice later on, their clothes aren't singed, their hair isn't singed. They don't smell like fire. What's the problem? The only thing that burned was the bonds they had. The only thing that burned was Nebuchadnezzar's attempts to remove their freedom. In the fire, they have more security because now Nebuchadnezzar can't reach out and harm them. You notice when he goes up to the fire, he goes in verse 26. He comes near to the door. He can't go up to the door. If he goes up, he dies from the fire that he made. It's too hot for anyone to survive. And so he hedges his way up near to the door and he calls out from a distance, "Can you come out here so that I can talk to you?" God's people, far from being harmed by the fire, are saved through the fire. Their circumstances are better in the problem than they were before the problem happened. And what is this? I see the fourth one walking around, and the fourth one, this fourth man, he's like a son of the gods. The only description that Nebuchadnezzar can come up with. He's not really sure what he's seeing. Some kind of angel, some kind of servant of God. Some people have suggested this is a form of Jesus before the incarnation, potentially. Don't have a strong opinion, although it's a nice picture. Think of it as Jesus. What do you see about this fourth man who's in there? The proof that God walks with his people. You see that he helps them in the fire. He doesn't help them avoid the fire. He helps them when they get in the fire. He helps them when they hit the coals and suddenly they realize it's not as hot as they thought it would be. He doesn't help them stay outside the door. He helps them once they enter in. God will not spare you from all of your problems, but he will certainly help you in the midst of them. That is the promise that he has made. He hasn't promised us comfort in life. He's promised to take us through and keep us safe in the end. Sometimes you have to get in the fire before you realize God's there. He shields them through the fire. He does not shield them from it. He does not protect his people from the inconveniences of life. He doesn't make your life nice and easy. He doesn't make everything you do succeed. He doesn't make you comfortable and well supplied. He promises enough. And enough is a lot less than you think it is. Sometimes he's more gracious than that. But he doesn't have to be. And he stays within the fire. That's an odd detail you don't really notice. There's nobody in the fire before the three go in. And then there are four. And then when the three come out, the fourth one never comes out. He's never seen. He's never present. He's never physically there. He doesn't walk out of the fire and prove who he is and show off to Nebuchadnezzar how great he is. He's in the fire. You don't see him until you're in there. Sometimes it's difficult to see him when you come out. But he doesn't come out. He's waiting to help his people in the fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't know God's purpose before they went in. They didn't know if they'd be saved going in. They didn't know if they would come out the other side. But then they go in and they find that there is a fourth man waiting in there for them, waiting to help them, waiting to save them. But it took them going in to realize that. Then they come out. Can't see him again. You look back in the fire, he's not there. He's not coming out with you. Where is he? I don't know. But next time I get thrown into the fire, I'm pretty sure he's still going to be in there because he's waiting. God's promise is one of preservation. God's promise is one of enough. God's promise is one of ultimate salvation. God's promise is not here for the earth. Sometimes he is gracious. He steps in. Daniel is saved from the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saved from the fire. Peter is saved from the prison in Acts 12. James wasn't. God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he's involved. Sometimes he doesn't seem to be involved. But he doesn't promise you all these physical trappings. He doesn't promise you all the physical safety. He doesn't promise you all the physical stuff. He promises you heaven if you are faithful. He promises you salvation if you prove steadfast. What happens if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bow down to the idol? They never see God. They never experience the problem, but they never experience salvation either. They never know what it's like to walk alongside Jesus. They never know what it's like to be there with an angel who's helping you through. Sometimes we got to stand for God, to worship him, and to face the fire, whatever might come. And maybe God will save. We know that he can. We know that he's able. We don't know if he's willing. but I'm going to be faithful anyway. And come what may, I'll see God in judgment, and I'll enter heaven as a servant. That's the promise that you have. When you're faced with idols today, when the world comes at you today, when tomorrow you go into the workplace and you're asked to bow down to something that you don't believe in, you're asked to follow something that you find false, you're asked to reject God and go against Him, what are you going to do? To stand for truth or to bow to the idol? You're not going to see Jesus standing there with you. He's not going to hold your hand and walk you through it. But He's going to be in there when you face the consequences. And He is going to help you through. Are you connected to Jesus? Are you connected to God? Do you have that faith and that relationship that will sustain you through the problems? Do you know who Jesus is? Or do you not? Because if you don't, I would love to introduce you to Him. If there is, as always, anything that we can do to help you connect with God, to help you understand who God is, to show that level of faith, to gain the faith that these three men had, if there is anything we can do to help you in that way, come and talk to me. You can see me afterwards, or I'll be standing right up here as we all stand and sing this song.